Okay, so today, looking at the French and Indian War and the aftermath, beginning to run up to the American Revolution. The French and Indian War, the Treaty of Paris, 1763, structure of the British government, Prime Minister George Grenville, Proclamation Line 1763, an act for the encouragement of officers making seizures, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, Townsend Revenue Acts, the Boston Massacre. The theme for the day is pride.
Whose pride?
Pride in general. Pride goeth before a fall. The Bible is listed as one of the 7 deadly sins. Traditional Catholic interpretation. Pride can be healthy in some modest doses. Encourage you to perform great tasks, do great deeds. But too much of it can blind you to certain realities.
Make you overconfident.
Overconfident.
Wise men do say that too much of anything is bad for you.
Exactly. Moderation in all things, including moderation. Pride can blind you to certain realities. Pride can blind you to your responsibilities.
Talk about the root of all sins.
And what we see here is, this time period, is the price of too much pride. The idea that you're too good for something. The idea you can ignore your responsibilities. The idea that because you accomplished something at one point means you don't have to keep working hard. Except history is replete with many great nations who built powerful states, accomplished many incredible feats, but fell apart. Usual cause, among many other things, pride, arrogance. The idea that they didn't have to work as hard anymore. They didn't have to keep pushing. Except Great Britain was a very powerful nation. A very large empire. As far as nations in Europe at the time period go, it's freer than most. Not quite as free as a nation as we would expect today. But because they've won a large war in their class-based society, their government thinks they don't have to listen to anybody. They know all the answers. What happens? They end up losing most of their empire. They will rebound. So by World War I, more than 1/4 people in the world live under the British Empire, but that huge gap they have in there is the loss of the United States. France was a very powerful nation. France was the center of style, fashion, art, diplomacy, science during the Enlightenment. Because they built incredibly lavish palaces. So it's King Louis XIV where we get the idea of France being fashionable. So they had powerful army, powerful navy. They had a very large empire in their own right. But within 30 years of the end of the French and Indian War, the monarchy will be abolished, the reigning king will be dead, and Europe will be in flames because of the chaos of the French Revolution. What caused that? Pride, arrogance. A king who felt like he didn't have to understand or worry about the concerns of the common man. What happens? They lose everything. And the seeds of both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Two revolutions will have repercussions across the world for centuries. Start right here. Backwoods, Pennsylvania, 1754. George Washington. So what I understand about history is one event builds on another. One decision causes a whole new series of decisions to be made. And one decision can change everything. So General will go left or go right. Does man decide to run for president or not? Does man decide to write the book or not? A conversation, one word, can change everything. And this is one of those moments that changes everything. One event builds on another. Now, see here on your books, page 110 to 111, see the radical differences in North America between 1713 and 1763. The difference between the two maps, the absence of France from the mainland of North America. Two powerful, ambitious nations. See the riches of the New World. Their holdings are expanding. Long-standing, simmering rivalry. Got hatred for each other. Decided that North America is not big enough for the two of them. They'd known for some time that a climactic fight was in the offing. And the French and Indian War is actually be tied to several other events in Europe. So it's also called the 7 Years' War. Some British historians called it the Great War for the Empire. Worldwide conflict started here in the United States. And eventually it's going to spread to the Mediterranean, India, across the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean Sea, all across the Americas, basically wherever they can fight. Like I say, this is a war that's going to drag in Russia, Austria, Prussia, all the great powers of Europe, Spain, France, Britain. Now, part of it is what's going on, contest for North America. But another part of it is a fight between the two great German states, Austria and Prussia, over control of one little slice of land called Silesia. That's to be the bulk of the campaigns of the continental Europe. So that's where you have Britain, Prussia, Holland, all fighting, France, Austria, Russia, Spain. Very powerful states, fighting with everything they've got. And of course, this is happening so many places. Britain has to basically send their troops all over the world. They spare very few professional troops for America. Because the professionally trained regular army troops, the redcoats. Colonists sometimes call them the lobsterbacks because of that red overcoat they wore. Now, the reason why they had these very brightly colored uniforms was, now you'd think, would they try to camouflage themselves? Yeah. Not 1760. Yeah. They're fighting in something called column formation. So they want to be seen. You're not hiding behind fences or barns or out in the trees. You're out in the open fighting each other, sometimes hand to hand. And so you need those brightly colored uniforms so you can see who's fighting who.
Not who's on which side.
Exactly. And that's why they had military bands begin. So they have the Army band today, the Navy band today, excellent musicians, but the tradition starts because they used music to relay orders to each other. So they can, it's very hard to hear your sergeant or your lieutenant screaming when there's a gunfire going on and you're fighting hand-to-hand somebody, but if you hear a tune, say retreat, advance, flank to the right, flank to the left, no quarter, whatever. If you hear that, then you know what the orders are. So it may take a moment to register, but at least you've heard the order and know what to do with that. Like I said, the British wore the bright red, the French wore a light blue, Prussians wore a dark blue uniform. I called it. You ever heard the color Prussian blue is where it comes from. Like I said, and the Russians wore kind of a dull green. And basically, with those uniforms in place, you knew who was fighting who. But the colonists, though, in the first years of the war, having to fight on their own. So local militias and the fighting professionally trained French troops. And the French have managed to convince most of the Native American tribes to fight on their side. So all these tribes, they've saw Washington's surrender as a sign of British weakness. So the early years of the fighting, it's not going well for the English. 1755, George Washington is riding out in a battle in Pennsylvania with the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, Lieutenant Governor Braddock. Braddock is killed in that battle. Washington barely survives.
Edward Braddock?
Yes.
I just remember reading some parts from different history documents about how reckless Braddock was in trying to maintain land. Is that true?
It depends on your perspective. You have to remember, real estate, that's a major economic livelihood for Virginia, and plus a major investment for himself.
Yeah, I also heard he was nicknamed the Bulldog.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It was, but what's happening here at this particular battle was he charged into an ambush.
He charged into an ambush?
Yeah. He thought he had an advantage, realized, oh, it was a trick. It's a trap.
Kind of sounds like Custer.
Not quite like Custer, but it could easily have been Custer, but most of the Virginia forces managed to retreat and return back to safety of Virginia.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
For some reason, the image of Admiral Akbar in Return of the Jedi comes to mind. It's a trap. But there's no Death Star. It's a space station.
Not yet, though.
But defeat after defeat by the English. War sets up in upstate New York. By 1755, most English settlers have withdrawn south of the Adirondacks and Pennsylvania, east of the Alleghenies, going towards more populated, more heavily defended areas. The frontier areas of upstate New York and western Pennsylvania are engulfed in battle, and settlers are trying to do whatever they can to save themselves. If this is the first time, though, all 13 colonies are fighting together. Previously, they fought maybe just a handful at a time, but now all 13 are working together against a common enemy. Well, probably the worst incident in the early phase of the war was 1757, the Battle of Fort William Henry. This is in upstate New York. commanding officer of Fort William Henry is doing everything he can to hold his position, begging for reinforcements, but none are coming. And the French and their Native American allies are advancing on them, eventually getting to the point where they're pummeling the fort with the French artillery. And Monroe has no choice but to surrender. Well, the French are very generous with their terms. They allow the English army and civilians inside to leave with their belongings and their weapons. They promise the English troops never again fight in North America. I was thinking, why wouldn't they just take them prisoner? You have to understand this is a different style of warfare these days. So this is a time when they literally believe death before dishonor. They would really rather die than face the idea that somehow some kind of attack on their name or reputation. And officers, their word was their bond. Your personal integrity as an officer meant absolutely everything. Prisoners were just taken at this time period but simply to hold them till others can be exchanged for other prisoners. But somehow, it's usually just a truce like this will work just as well. So, French have won today. They seized the fort. This is the key to defenses in upstate New York. This is their linchpin for the Hudson River Valley. That's fallen. Now there's some kind of miscommunication between the French and their tribal allies. Usually the tribes are promised spoils of war, something like that, and somehow they're not getting enough this time. And so instead of allowing the British to retreat in peace, what the tribes do, at least tribal allies do, is they break off, pursue the retreating British. Remember, they're under a flag of truce here. And then ambush them, attacking the retreating British troops and civilians alike. And so the attack is repelled, but with very heavy casualties. Now, that incident later became a part of a very famous novel, Last of the Mohicans. I've seen the movie or the book. This was based on a real incident.
Really?
Yeah.
True story?
Well, a couple of variations in Hawkeye and the others that kind of made up. But there really was a Colonel Monroe. There really was the attack on the fort.
And there were
was
really
attack on the retreating column.
And there really were Native Americans who adopted white settlers, of course.
Yeah, that happened every so often. But true incidents based as put in The Last of the Mohicans. Classic American novel.
I find it very sad to see how Usgun died.
Yeah. But at this point, the British are in full retreat in the colonies. They're having manpower shortages. Can't get enough people to sign up. Having supply shortages. So the British appoint a new Minister of War, William Pitt. He's also the British Foreign Minister, and basically his orders are to pull out all the stops. Do whatever it takes to stabilize the situation in the Americas, get the war situation back under control.
Kind of sounds a bit reckless.
Yeah, the order's kind of reckless, but these are desperate times.
You said William Pitt role was what?
Desperate measures.
He's a foreign minister and a war minister, and his job is to get the war back under control. So what Pitt does is resorts to a system of impressment to make up the following numbers. Now impressments, it's not like a draft where basically your name, your birthday's put in a hat and they draw you out and win a free all-expense paid trip to the front lines. Now impressment is you're walking down the street and these nice redcoats come up and their rifle say, "Congratulations, you've joined His Majesty's Army." Throw you in line and train you for a couple days or however long it takes, and throw you on the front line. And of course, the question is, why wouldn't somebody in the circumstances turn around and run?
Really?
You really want to be in the front line where you're going to have about 100 guys pointing a gun at you and a couple cannons.
Exactly.
Where you can just either try and run away and live and either manage to get away just barely with your life or shot dead right there and not be blown to bits on the battlefield slowly.
Yeah, because they would, it's something called desertion.
I can give some more if you want.
At desertion charges, it's a death penalty offense. That if your lieutenant turn around, they say you're running, that you're a superior officer, turn around and say, "Shoot that guy," or drag him back and hang him. In fact, it's still, I think it's still on the books, Uniform Code of Military Conduct. It's still
Yes,
death penalty offense, United States military.
Well,
Hardly
definitely,
yet.
I don't know about that.
Hasn't been used since World War II, but it is still on the books. Basically, it's like I say, get to Western civilization, of course, they how the Russians handled it, and it was not pretty. So basically, you got all these troops in the front line being forced into service, imprisonment, and Pitt is telling his troops, short of supplies, go to the warehouses, shops, take whatever you need, and take it to the front line. Colonial response, not good. Riots in New York City over this. So it's a fierce tension rising between the colonists and the English, forcing Pitt to relax most of these policies by the next year. But in that year, in those few months, the situation started to change, partly because of what Pitt did in the meantime to plug up all the holes, and plus the new problems the French are having. Well, Pitt, in 1758, ordered his troops to repay merchants for all the goods they'd taken, and starts returning control of recruitment back to the colonial governors. So things just calming down a little bit. Now the French have their problems. France, though a powerful nation, it's overpopulated and underdeveloped. You have all these huge farms made a lot of money for the aristocrats for centuries, but they only make enough to make a nice profit for themselves. So agricultural production is not very efficient, so France is always one bad harvest away from famine. 1758, bad harvest year. Napoleon, the later French general, once said, an army marches on its stomach, meaning that you need to have the proper amount of food and supplies for an army to function adequately. Because these are guys marching, could be up to hundreds of miles of rough terrain. They have to be able to stop and fight the best they can at a moment's notice, which means they have to be healthy. To maintain that state of health and their strength, they have to be adequately fed. If not, you're going to lose battles. Like I said, in wars like the French and Indian War, the largest casualties actually come from disease, not from battlefield injuries. That's not actually until the world wars start, the 20th century, where most of your deaths are due to battlefield injuries. Improvements in sanitation by the 20th century led to those death rates dropping.
Back then, during the Indian War, it was just this little metal ball that got shot into you, so it didn't necessarily kill you.
Like I said, it didn't necessarily, but it could do enough. Depends on where you got shot
Yeah,
at.
but
Do enough damage. A lot of times they might just have to amputate your leg, but remember, no antibiotics, so
yeah,
if it got infected, there's nothing they can do about it.
use rusty blades and stuff.
Yeah. doctors didn't wash their hands between patients either.
Yeah.
They didn't change the dressings very often. Except nursing students, this class be appalled by the conditions in so many of these field hospitals, but it's the best they knew how at the time. And a lot of knowledge we have from treating critical injuries and even treatment of post-operative wounds comes from what the doctors learned in battle, these battlefield hospitals. Unfortunately, in the meantime, it means catastrophic death rates. On 1758, fortress at Louisbourg, which is on the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. This is a major fortress for the French. It's basically protecting the Gulf of St. Lawrence and St. Lawrence River Valley, basically keeping the English Navy from sailing down the St. Lawrence River and attacking Canada. Well, in July, Louisbourg fell to the English. That fall, Fort Duquesne, where the whole thing started, fell without a fight. Now the English are going back on the offensive. 1759, you have the Battle of Quebec. It's called the Plains of Abraham. Follows the very clever tactics of an English general, James Wolfe. See, Quebec was the largest and is the largest city in French Canada. But here along the St. Lawrence River, it's kind of perched on a cliff. Steep cliff, but steep enough that try to have your army climb it or cross the stream, they're going to notice it. The city's up over here. And so General Wolfe is spending some time kind of charting up and down the river banks, just trying to figure out how's he going to get across. And he figures it out. One night, when the French attention is distracted, he has his troops carefully scale the cliffs and assemble on top of the cliffs, an area called the Plains of Abraham. And by dawn, his armies are across, his troops are assembled, and the French are surprised all of a sudden the English army's here, when by all conventional military tactics, they shouldn't be. Wolfe changed the game. See, French arrogance ends up costing them the city. So the French busily pull out as many troops as they can. They fight, but the English had the advantage on them. And by the end of the day, the city is theirs. Wolfe, though, is mortally wounded in the battle. He is informed that the city has been won, that the battle is his, just before he died. This is a major loss for the French. 1760, the English take Montreal, which is the capital of French Canada, essentially ending the American phase of the war. Still be some skirmishes here and there, fighting between the navies. France brings Spain into the war as an ally in 1761, try to cut their losses, but by 1761 it's too little too late. And the war continues until it's in 1763. Now, Treaty of Paris 1763, this treaty formally ends the French and Indian War. It's called that because of the American perspective. It's who the colonists were fighting, the French and their Native American allies. The issue of North American colonial supremacy is settled in favor of the British, rapidly becoming the most powerful nation on earth. The French Empire in North America is eliminated. The Spanish, hobbled by years of debts and mismanagement, steadily fades from power. Spain still pack a punch, but they're not near the power they used to be. So here's what happens in the treaty. Spain cedes to Britain Florida. At that point, still mostly just populated the Panhandle area, but all Florida into English possession. France cedes to Britain Canada, the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Great Lakes region, and Louisiana east of the Mississippi River. And also a couple of possessions in the Caribbean, various holdings in the Caribbean and India. Now at this point, France still has basically the area west of the Mississippi River. Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, on up towards Canada, back towards the Rocky Mountains. France is still making a nice little profit off this region, but realized the tactical situation. The English could come in and seize it any time they wanted to. The cost of defending it was just simply too high, so it's kind of a consolation prize France gives to Spain. Louisiana west of the Mississippi River. So for about the next 40 years, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, it's going to be Spanish territory. The Spanish really aren't able to do much with it. So essentially, the eastern half of North America is now totally in English hands. Now, let's take a minute to kind of explain how the English government works. England is a constitutional monarchy, which means they have a monarchy, but there are limits on the control, on the powers of the monarchy. They can only do so much. And since England doesn't have exactly a written constitution, powers of the government shift over time. Basically, what they refer by the English Constitution is simply their legal precedents they've established. A king at this time period is going to be George III. King from 1760 to 1820. Takes over when George II dies. So initially he's a very popular king, reform-minded. Young king that ruled a nation who just had a tremendous victory. So people are very proud of their king and country. And unlike a lot of other kings, this king actually stays home at night, shall we say. But as part of the English monarchy, you have a king or a queen. It's a hereditary monarchy. The oldest male child in line gets the throne. At least traditionally, Queen Elizabeth has changed it to after William is going to be whoever is the oldest. Charles and William is going to be whoever is the oldest surviving child, the king or queen. King does have some powers at this point, particularly a veto power, but it hasn't been exercised since the 17 teens. He said, 300 years now, the monarchy has had a veto. They have not vetoed any legislation out of Parliament. They could exercise it, but they'd probably lose that power the next day. Of course, here's the problem with hereditary monarchy. Yes, you have a stable line of succession, but how do you know these people are any good for the job? The old man may have done a good job, but the kid could be a complete idiot. And that's happened a lot of times. Said George was fairly competent at first, but because he had a parliament to back him up, but there's a problem with him. It turned out years later he had a condition called porphyria. It's a neurological condition. It has a series of bizarre symptoms, including turning your urine blue. Some kind of chemical imbalance in the body caused by the disease, but also causes mental instability and eventually insanity. And as George grew older, his insanity grew worse and worse. There's this one point where he had this long conversation with this tall tree he thought was the King of Prussia. Well, they're both tall, straight, and thin, so I guess it's easy to make that mistake, but here's the problem with the monarchy. Once they're in place, there's no way you can get rid of them. England was really the only country to have some kind of system in place where they could theoretically do that. But to do so is basically revolution. If you're wrong, it's an act of treason. So they want to be very, very careful about this. You just don't walk up to the king in 1760, 1770, or 80 and say, you're nuts. Exactly. Not if you want to keep your head attached to your body.
That's a bit scary.
Yeah. So there's some instances late in his life that George has, he's in and out. He has some clear thinking, lucid moments, but a lot of times it's getting worse and worse. By 1810, they have to declare it called regency. Basically, his son, George IV, takes over as king, performing all of his official duties, but the title still stays with George III until he dies in 1820. And towards the end of his days, people actually kind of felt sorry for him. He was blind and deaf and just completely out of it, just spent all of his days locked in a room banging on a harpsichord. So you got that situation. Then you have Parliament. In place since the 1300s. Initially, it's just the tax-making body of the British government. Initially, just an advisory body that takes on taxing powers. Eventually becomes the sole law-making body of the English government. Two houses of Parliament. The upper house, the House of Lords, lower house, House of Commons. Now, the House of Lords, that's basically your titled nobility. Your dukes and barons and so forth. You get it because you're basically born into it, or because you receive a special title from the king. And they also have veto. They can't propose legislation, but they can veto anything coming out of the Commons. The Commons is elected. So at this point, the Commons are anything but. That is, to be eligible to vote in an election, you have to basically be white, Protestant, extremely upper class, major landholder. Some parliamentary constituencies there may only be 5 eligible voters. But that's going to change a lot over time. In fact, in England, women will get the right to vote before the United States grants them rights. But the House of Commons proposes all legislation. As the Prime Minister is in charge of the House of Commons. Today, it's just the head of the majority party in Parliament. In this case, today it's Stephen Harper, because that's Canada. But the head of the majority party is the head of the Prime Minister. But in this time period, though, the king could still play power broker and basically appoint the Prime Minister. If he thought that a more effective majority would be run around one person rather than another, push through his legislative agenda. In terms of a Prime Minister, basically anywhere from a few months to a few years. England's had both. Basically, can you survive an election? Can your ruling coalition survive an election? Can you survive what's called no confidence vote? Basically, Parliament can vote you out of office as Prime Minister. You're not kicked out of Parliament, but you're no longer Prime Minister. Sometimes these no confidence votes, the king will just dissolve the government and call for a new election. So you have these very unstable terms of office in these years following the French and Indian War. No one's able to have a decisive majority. No one's able to make any kind of clear decisions. So, from 1763 to 1765, you have George Grenville as Prime Minister. Now here's the problem. They've won a huge victory. The French are no longer a problem, but there's a cost to pay for that. Wars are expensive. If you win, wars are expensive. You got to spend all that money feeding those troops, training them. You got to pay them. You got to clothe them. They got to have tents. You got to transport them from one part of the world to another. It's very expensive to do. And then once the war is over, you don't need that large standing army because it is so expensive. So he demobilized all those troops. So a lot of them, you can go home now. There are always, after major wars, serious economic problems. Because all these companies that are filling these contracts with the government for the military, well, the government doesn't need those contracts anymore, cancels them, so they start laying people off or go out of business. Now have all these troops that are out of work because they've been demobilized. Well, their jobs are either taken up by somebody else or the companies they work for, they're out of business. So you often have these post-war recessions and post-war depressions. Grenville's going to try to avoid that, but also he's got a problem with the fact that England has a huge war debt that's got to be paid. See? Now, what are the two ways a government can pay debt? What's that? Taxes, one. So you got bills to pay, you can borrow money, but you're going to have to pay off that one eventually. What happens if a country doesn't pay its bills, doesn't pay its debts?
They start taking stuff.
Yeah, in the old days, countries would start invading, basically start repossessing the whole country. But today, basically, your credit rating goes to the toilet. Mass inflation, the value of your currency collapses, your economy collapses. Because you're not paying your debts, well, why should somebody do business with you? You have to pay your debts. It doesn't matter if you agree or how these debts were brought up. You still got to pay them. So if you're against the French and Indian War, hey, too bad, you still got these bills to pay.
It's kind of a little like passing the buck, don't you think?
Exactly, it's a great political tradition, and saves politicians having to make a hard and probably unpopular decision, but you have to understand when you're in a position like that, whether it be in the corporate world, the political world, you're in that position, you have to make the hard decision. And Grenville basically decides he's going to pass the buck. Now, the English have a new problem in the Americas. All those Native American allies of the French, they're still there. They still don't like the English. So you have a lot of fighting between the tribes and the English now. Eventually that settles down, but the way Grenville settles that, though, is through this, the Proclamation Line of 1763. So it draws a big line down the map of the colonies and says, English settlers cannot move beyond the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. They can't settle west of there. They're going to reserve those lands for the tribes. But this upsets the colonists who felt like they fought for those lands. These are theirs. Especially Virginia, they got all that land in Ohio they were trying to settle. And settlers already pouring into Kentucky and Tennessee. But that's only one of the problems. But of course, this proclamation line, are the colonists going to agree to it? Are they going to abide by it? No, they're going to ignore it. City of Pittsburgh, named after William Pitt, was founded in 1772 in western Pennsylvania, well past the proclamation line. Grenville also realizes another thing, that they got this large navy and they knew they were losing a lot of money off smuggling, people not paying their taxes. So what do? And after the encouragement of officers making seizures. That's by Parliament. Basically, they're going to tighten up customs collection. Those writs of assistance from the earlier navigation acts, they're going to ramp those up, give those to a ton of customs collectors, and turn them loose. Go anywhere, anytime, try to collect. And one portion of this act, the Navy, when I'll be patrolling coastal waters off America, tried to catch ships leaving port without paying their taxes or their import duties. And then what happens once the Navy catches these ships is they take them all the way up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, as far away from the colonies as you can possibly get on that side of the Atlantic. And there you'll be tried in a Vice Admiralty court. Basically, what a Vice Admiralty court is, it's a military court tried by senior officers, usually captains, vice admirals, things like that. But it's different from British civilian law. Remember, military law, it's established to, the main goal of mine is to maintain order in the unit. Make sure everyone's being treated fairly, but basically, you're guilty until proven innocent in a military court. Especially British military courts at this time. Now, in the civilian courts, you have a right to an attorney, you have a right to a jury trial. You don't have that in a Vice Admiralty court. Here's what happens. The English are using military courts to try civilians for violation of civilian tax law. They've completely rewritten the rules here. And the traditional legal guarantees that English citizens expect don't exist here. So you can see already why they're going to start getting upset. And then, once this problem solved, this tightening of collections is done, Grenville's going to start imposing a whole series of new taxes. colonial objection to that is taxation's always been a local matter. These taxes are being imposed by Parliament. How many votes, how many representatives do the colonies have in Parliament? Exactly 0. No voice. So this is where the seeds of the American Revolution started to be sown. Basically, all the rules and guarantees and liberties they expected as English citizens that were guaranteed under law were being steadily thrown out. Remember, it's not the amount of taxes they're objecting to, it's how it's being done. Yeah. We'll talk about that more next time. Chapters 5 and 6 of the book.